lectures on vulnerable groups will be at a distinct advantage when it comes to the essay. All right? So, there we go. So I would like you to welcome Professor Renzaho and, what can we say? Take lots of notes. Okay? I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Deborah. So I would like to thank Deborah for inviting me here to give you a guest lecture on internally displaced people. Can you hear me? Good. I'm too loud, so that's fine. I'm pretty sure you can hear me. So today we are going to talk about internally displaced people. So my hope is that at the end of this lecture, you will be able to define all types of migration. You will be able to distinguish internally displaced people from refugees. You will be able to articulate some of the international laws guiding displacement, and you'll be able actually to define what are called soft and hard laws governing internal displacement. So why, what is internal displacement? And how does it differ from other forms of migration? So as many of you will be aware, most people will tend to migrate for various reasons. Some will voluntarily migrate in search for greener pastures, and those who migrate voluntarily may go from one country to another, may move from one rural area to urban areas in search of employment, better salaries, may come to Australia in search of, education opportunities for their children, etc. However, those are the privileged one because they have the means to move away. They can pay for their transport. They can afford to pay, the transport for their families to relocate to another location. But there is another group of migrants who we call forced migrants. The forced migrants are the most vulnerable one. So they are vulnerable because they are being forced to move from their usual area of residence to relocate to another new area where they leave all their belongings and sometimes lose their family members, either killed or lost, etc., in search for safety. However, they can be displaced for various reasons. Among you, I assume some of you were young when the tsunami hit the Southern Asia, including also Indonesia and Aceh. So tsunami is an example of forced migration where people were forced to migrate due to climatic conditions. We have seen cases of floods. We have seen cases of, climate change, climate change and the related disasters. So natural disasters could be a cause of forced migration. But you could have also human-made disasters. So it's when people are displaced because of conflicts, ethnic conflicts, religious conflicts, wars, armed conflict, political instability, etc. But one of the most neglected areas of forced displacement is what we call development-induced displacement, especially like a lot of mining companies in Australia. And an example could be around the PNG, where you displace people from their land because you want to overexploit their land without even compensating them. So this is one of the biggest issues in most low and middle income countries, such as in Africa, where mining companies from the developed world are coming to forcibly displace people from their lands so they can exploit them and without compensating them. Usually with the governments usually are accomplice in that practice because government gets taxed and through corruption and they are unable to protect their own constituency. We have also the case of slavery, such as human trafficking. When, for example, you go to the Philippines, you convince a group of young girls that if they come to Australia, you are going to give them good employment, And once they arrive in Australia, you hold them hostage as sex workers. So those are also, forcibly displaced people because they don't have any identity. They don't have any way of reclaiming their right. But how does an internally displaced person differ from a refugee or from an asylum seeker? You have seen on TV people asking you, be generous to refugees, be generous to asylum seekers. What is the difference? They are quite very different. So when people are forced to move away from their usual area of residence, there are three possible scenarios. The first scenario is where the person leaves his usual area of residence, relocates to another area, but does not cross the border, still within the same country, such as you get displaced from Victoria to New South Wales. You are still in Australia, but you no longer live in your area, your usual area of residence. So that person is called an internally displaced person. The second scenario is when then you cross the border to another country, such as you cross to go to New Zealand. But once you arrive in New Zealand, you need to declare yourself as an asylum seeker. If your claim for asylum seeker is accepted, then you are accepted as a refugee. But if it can't be if it can't be proved that actually you are seeking asylum, then you are not recognized as a refugee, then you are recognized as an asylum seeker. So most of those people on Manus Island are asylum seekers because, yes, they cross the border, they are no longer in their country of birth, but their claim for asylum seeker status has been rejected by Australia. That's why they are asylum seekers. And as soon as their claim is accepted, then they are accepted as refugees, and they are protected under the Refugee Convention. So the Refugee Convention, you are aware of it, the 1951 Refugee Convention. This is a convention to protect the right of refugees, which was put together after the Second World War. But as you will know, when this was created, it was very racist-oriented because it was only for European. Only Europeans were protected. So if you're from Asia, Africa, South America, you are not covered under the UN Refugee Convention. It was not until 1967 that they recognized that actually it doesn't matter whether you're European, whether you are African, whether you are South American. Once you are a refugee, you are a refugee. So in 1967, they inserted a protocol to recognize refugees wherever they are, regardless of their country of origin, regardless of their race, ethnicity, religion. If you are a refugee, you are a refugee, and you should be protected under the Refugee Convention and its subsequent protocol. So how many internally displaced people are there worldwide? You can see we talk about refugees, but refugees are minority. Actually, it's not even a big number. Even though most developed countries are talking about accepting, helping refugees, the biggest burden is actually internally displaced people who have been neglected, and I'm compassionate about these guys. What should we do to really help them overcome the suffering, overcome the poor conditions they live in? Because no one talks about their plight. Everyone is about helping refugees, but internally displaced people have been neglected. Unfortunately, they are the majority of all forced migrants. So of the 51 million displaced people, forcibly displaced people, almost 70% are internally displaced people. Refugees are only 16.7 million, so a small number. So we need to be the advocate of internally displaced people in order to help them overcome the poor conditions they live in. The majority of internally displaced people are in Africa, unfortunately. And as you can see, in Africa, because of the political instability, ethnic conflict, armed wars, you go to the Great Lake, for example, where I come from, like in Congo, around Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, it's a mess. So everyone killing everyone. So people have to run away, and most people don't leave their countries. So you can see Africa still has the biggest burden of internal displaced people, followed by the Middle East. North Africa, not so much, but more the Middle East. Although North Africa, Libya, after the removal of Gaddafi, so Libya is another area where internal displacement is a serious issue. So if we have a refugee convention that protects refugees, who is responsible for protecting internally displaced people? Because remember, the refugee convention doesn't cover internally displaced people because, one, they haven't crossed the border. Because to be a refugee, you have to have crossed the border. So which means because they haven't crossed the border, they are not protected under the refugee convention. So what are the other tools, legal tools available to protect the right of internally displaced people? You need to realize that when they are running away, they are going through different phases. First of all is the phase of when you leave. Because when you leave, sometimes you live in chaos. You leave your house, your assets, you get separated from your family, and during during your journey toward running away, you are exposed to other risks until you reach where you think you can settle and be safe. So there are three phases: during the leaving the area, running away during the relocation, and during settlement. So, and at every phase, and also there's the fourth phase, which is when they return. When they think that peace may have prevailed, they need to go back home to reclaim their belongings. So at each level, at each phase of displacement, they are exposed to risks and dangers. So remember, they are not, because they haven't crossed the border, they are not protected by the UN, the Refugee Convention, but also, and the UN Convention, which is covered by the refugee law, which means then they don't enjoy the same right as refugees, but also by the fact that they may have been displaced for other reasons other than conflict. So if, for example, they're being displaced by a natural disaster, then they are not covered by humanitarian law. The humanitarian law, which then gives them right to assistance of shelter, food, water, drinking, everything, clothes, cooking utensils. So, which means then they are not covered by humanitarian law, and hence they don't have access to humanitarian assistance. So they need to vouch for themselves. And they are not covered directly by the human rights law because they are seen as the burden for their own countries, which makes them even more vulnerable. Because most of the time they run away from conditions created by their own government that's supposed to protect them, and then they are left in the hands of the same government, that put them in that miserable condition. So you can see how many times internally displaced people are disadvantaged. So the first law that was put in place to start to look after the needs of internally displaced people was known as the Law of Lagos. So the Law of Lagos was put in place in early 1960s as African countries were gaining independence and human rights abuses became so prevalent and people were really being forcibly displaced and there was no one to look after them. So the Law of Lagos was put in place as a way of protecting them. I think I might have jumped to one. Oh, there's one slide missing. I know, I get there. So when I get to the slide of Lagos Law, I will skip it. So the Lagos Law then was there to be able to put in place a draft that recognized the right of internally displaced people in terms of how do they deal with land dispute, for example. If people are going back after displacement and their land has been occupied by somebody else who is claiming that this land also is mine, how do you deal with land dispute? Because if there is no resolution, land dispute could lead to another conflict again, where then there is another ethnic conflict, and then people get displaced again. Then there is around the, in every community you have different ethnic groups. We always have majority and minorities. So how are minorities being managed and oppressed, and who's protecting them, for example? For example, when I come from, like in Congo, Muslims represent, for example, only 2%. They are minority from a religious point of view. So if they were oppressed, who is responsible for protecting them? Whereas if you go to Libya, Christian will represent less than 1%. The majority are Muslims. If they are a minority, who is protecting them? So you need to think about who are the marginalized and who is responsibility to protect them. Then you know that sometimes when you're fleeing, people may destroy your assets, destroy houses, destroy your crops, etc. Who is responsible and how can you be compensated? So those are issues that any law put in place should be dealing with. So I've already covered this one. So I was talking about the law of Lagos, and the law of Lagos, once it put together a draft outlining principles for protecting internally displaced people. But it was not sufficient. And 25 years later, in 1986, it became a stepping stone to inform what we call the African Charter. And the African Charter was more toward building on the law of Lagos and making it comprehensive in trying to cover all the needs of internally displaced people, including the right to protection, because protection was a big issue. Once you are displaced, are you protected against human rights abuses? And that became the cornerstone of the African Charter, protection. And then, in order to enforce the African Charter, they put together what they call the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights. So this commission was to enforce the implementation of the African Charter. So in other words, this was the police, the one that will police which government is violating the African Charter. But the problem of this one, though, was that the commission was poorly advertised. So imagine you are born in Africa, you know that the African Charter exists and the commission exists, but you never heard of it. So if you are abused, you don't know where to go. How can you engage them to represent you? So because it was poorly advertised, most Africans didn't know about it, hence they could never use it when they sought to claim their right. And the other issue is it was poorly funded by the African Union, that it relied on fundings from the European Union, for the USAID, you name them, which meant then they were prone to manipulation, only to implement the goals of those Westerners at the expense of the rights of the constituency they're supposed to be protecting. So which means then it became a puppet of the West rather than a body seen as a credible and capable of representing the rights of its constituency. So it lost face in terms of its ability to be able to uphold human rights abusers and make them accountable for their crimes. Which meant then no one respected it, hence the need to put in place more robust legal framework. And the first person to be commissioned was Mr. Francis Deng, who was the first secretary on human rights and adjunct to the UN secretary, and his role was to review all existing legal framework that protect internally displaced people and assess their effectiveness in order to achieve that goal. But after all his assessment, he came to the conclusion that all existing legal framework were deficient in their ability to protect internally displaced people, and put forward some principles that should guide the protection of internally displaced people. However, these guiding principles were what we call soft laws. So soft laws are those laws you can't be held, they are not binding, and if you don't obey or implement them, no one can penalize you. Which meant then, if there are soft laws, what will happen? No state is going to respect them because they know by not respecting them, no one will ever hold them accountable. So being soft laws made them really prone to being demeaned by the states and being accepted by states who are responsible for protecting the rights of internally displaced people. But, you know, and when Mr. Deng proposed his principles, the guiding principles, the emphasis was again on protection. And protection at all phases. Remember, there are 4 phases. Protection during fleeing, protection during living, during fleeing, during settlement, and during the return. At every 4 phases of displacement, protection became the cornerstone of the guiding principle. And because there were soft laws, and because no state could never be held accountable if they didn't implement them, it meant that they were not sufficiently ratified by all the states, and hence were vulnerable to being demeaned and not respected. Which meant then they had to rethink what to do. And in those who have been following the news, in the Great Lake, so the Great Lake has 11 countries. So Congo, where I come from, it's the central. Then it's surrounded by 10 countries: Angola, Uganda, Rwanda, Central African Republic, and the other Congo, etc. There are 2 Congos. Mine is the big Congo there. And as you know, there was a war there, 5 million people were killed, and hence every single principle guarding internally displaced people had failed to protect internally displaced people. They had to rethink. Hence, there was the international conference on the Great Lakes to develop protocols in order to protect internally displaced people in the region. The cornerstone of those principles, were 4, because the argument was that protection alone is not sufficient unless you have provided other means of survival and self-sufficiency. So, as you can see, the first one was still protection, so through peace and security. So that's okay. Protection still became one of the dominant themes. But the emphasis was on democracy and governance, because we knew that if there is no governance and there's no democracy and there is a likelihood of other conflict, the issue for internally displaced people will remain there and will become a burden both to the region and the international community. Then how do we ensure that internally displaced people are not dependent on outside assistance, but can be self-sufficient and sustain their needs? So the emphasis was on economic development, and then on social issues such as family separation, family reunion, and above all, documentation. Because internally displaced people, one of the challenge is when you leave your identity. When you come back, you don't have an identity. You can't say, this is my land. Because you say, this is my land, they say, do you have an ID? No, I lost it. How can you claim this is your land if you don't have ID? So documentation, making sure people ID can be established during all phases of internal displacement. And they came up with 10 protocols. Of the 10 protocols, it had 33 priorities, and those priorities had to be accepted by those countries in the Great Lake region. And the advantage of this protocol, as opposed to the guarding principle I outlined earlier, the guarding were soft laws, these were hard laws. So hard laws means they were binding. So which means if you sign them, you were accepting that should you be found to have abused people's human rights, you can be held accountable, you can be put through the judicial system, you can be held accountable for all crimes you have committed. Which meant then, because they are hard laws, what do you think? States may not ratify them. Well, because by ratifying them, it means it can be held accountable. So by making them hard laws, states say, no, I'm not going to ratify them. Because if you don't ratify them, no one can hold you accountable. And so, even though this was held as a success, even though it was on development, democracy, governance, etc., to convince all the regions, all the countries to ratify them became a serious problem. Countries were afraid of many things. For example, how do you address the issue of accountability and the reconciliation? When, for example, people go back to reclaim their land, who is accountable to decide that the land belongs to the internally displaced person? Is the government going to accept accountability? And if so, what processes are in place to facilitate reconciliation so that you can promote what we call the democracy and governance? So most states were afraid of that because it was a big burden and very costly. How about the inclusion of sub-regional authorities? Because most governments in those countries, not like in Australia, where you have a federal, the Commonwealth, state, and the local council. And the local council is responsible for that. Most of them are very centralist governments, where you have a president, they are in Kinshasa, and everyone is the capital. And most people never been to the capital anyway, too far away and too expensive. Now, how do you explain that decisions will be taken centrally, not knowing what's going on locally, and be able to involve those authorities regionally to be involved in durable solution for internally displaced people? That became a challenge because there's no way of coordinating that. Coordination became an issue. Now, because then there were hard laws, and out of the 11 countries of a Great Lake, only few ratified it, and Uganda was the leading country to ratify it first. But also it covered only the Great Lake region. The extent to which could cover the whole Africa became impossible because most countries will be saying, yeah, but the Great Lake Protocol are only for the Great Lake. We are in Western Africa. How does it apply to Ghana, Mali, or Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, or Horn of Africa, Ethiopia? So which meant then they had to mobilize some other hard laws that build on the Great Lake Protocol, bring in the guiding principles, but applies across Africa. So the Kampala Convention was born, which was coordinated by the African Union, and all the heads of state had to participate and agree on the principles that will guide the protection of internally displaced people. Again, the Kampala was also a hard law. So Kampala, like the Great Lake Protocol, unlike the guiding principles which were soft, both Kampala and the Great Lake Protocols were hard laws, meaning they were binding. So the Kampala Convention also experienced the same issue, because being binding, being hard laws, to convince that state to ratify it, it's complicated, because once they ratify it, it means they will be held accountable if they ever commit a crime. But without repeating myself, so it's a hard law, and that would differentiate it from the guiding principles. And also, the emphasis was on, while the other protocols never promoted encouraging IDP to return, this actually was purposeful in making sure they can stimulate the need to return, for internally displaced people to return back home. And so in doing so, they had to ensure that reconstruction, because most property will have been destroyed, that if you go back, your house can be rebuilt. If you lost a house, somebody will build you a house again, give you access to your land, build the house again, give you all the means to be able to live a successful life. So that would differentiate them from the other protocol. And also the sustainable environment and economic development became a cornerstone. But as you can see, of all the African states, and remember, signing it and ratifying it is different. You can sign it without ratifying it. Sign it doesn't mean you have ratified it. It's just, I agree, but I'm not ratifying it that I'm going to implement it in my country. So you can see, of all of them, less than 3/4 signed it and less than half could ratify it. So which meant then implementing it became problematic. How are we going to implement it if the majority of a state never ratified it? So it became really a very difficult tool to implement, to enforce, because ratifying it was a challenge. Now, the advantage of a Great Lake Protocol and the Kampala Convention came up with those bold priorities. Bold priorities in terms of what do we do with refugees, protection, governance, economic development, sustainable development. But those are bold statements. They are what I call blanket statements. If you had to measure success, what are the indicators? So there were statements without indicators. So hence, the Interagency Standing Committee was put in place to be able now to define what indicators can be used to measure durable solutions for internally displaced people. Indicators and standards. So that was the purpose of the Interagency Standing Committee. And so they want to come up with 4 pillars, and under each pillar, they had to make sure they have indicators. The first pillar, which is the human rights challenges. So what are the human rights challenges, and what indicators can we use to measure whether human rights abuses did not occur during displacement, during resettlement, during returning, etc. So human rights became one of the first cornerstones against which to place indicators. And the right to repatriation, the right to identity, all those are human rights indicators. The other one was humanitarian challenge. For example, who's responsible for the needs of internally displaced people? If they are not covered by the humanitarian law and hence can be assisted as refugees, if they are not covered by refugee law, if they are not covered by human rights laws, who is responsible? What indicators can we use actually to judge whether their humanitarian needs have been met? Right to shelter, right to food, right to water and sanitation. Because if you don't give them sanitation, you just need cholera, the whole population disseminated. So right to, to schooling, children have to go to school. Otherwise, if they are internally displaced for 10 years, you are telling me those children will never go to school. So everything, humanitarian assistance, who's responsible for that? And how can we measure that we've succeeded in that area? Then the right to development, where you are trying to stimulate the economy within that community so they can be self-sufficient. And then the peace building. For example, you want to make sure that when they return in an area that is peaceful, and the likelihood of more conflict that will lead to redisplacement can be minimized through peace building and conflict resolution. So these are the 8 indicators they put forward. So according to the Standing Committee, for an internally displaced people to be able to put a value on whether durable solutions have worked, you need to make sure that safety and security are in place, measures. You need to make sure that they have adequate living standards of living. As I said, water, shelter, sanitation, education, health, access to health, immunization, all above. And access to livelihood. For example, stimulate agriculture, for example. If they may have land, but they don't have access to seeds. So do we provide them seeds so that we can stimulate the agriculture in that community? Because we know if they start cultivating their own crops, they are less likely to be reliant on international assistance, etc. Land and property. Again, the issue of land and property is very hard for 2 things. In Australia, when you buy a house, you have to go through council. Most people will have your land mapped up, the size and when and the name. You can trace down generation of ownership. And here the land belongs to the person who bought it. But in most countries, especially Asia and mostly Africa and some Asian countries, there are what we call customary ownership of land. which means the land belongs to the chiefdom. And then complicated by the government saying, we also have legislations that govern land. So, and there's a conflict. And for example, in Australia, there are land for the first people of a nation, Aboriginal and Strait Islander, when they claim ownership of the land. So that's called the traditional ownership of the land. In Africa, it's no different. So when it comes to traditional ownership of the land, then negotiate land rights becomes even more complicated. Because who do you deal with? Within that chiefdom becomes too complicated. So dealing with, and most government legislation, land, like in Uganda now, the majority of the land is, even if it's your land, you bought it, it's a lease. After 99 years, the government will take it back. So which means then it becomes land ownership, and the right for IDPs to access their own land becomes complicated due to those customary laws and non-clear legislations governing the land ownership. The other big issues during displacement is family separation, especially it's every man for themselves. Imagine rebels start shooting rockets, everyone is running in different direction. You find yourself as wife there, husband in another region, and a child in another region, and sometimes you get story, oh, your husband died, you remarry, thinking your husband died, and when it comes to returning back to village, you turn up with a second husband, and your husband turns up, oh, he's not dead. There you are. And that makes it even harder when it comes to land, because land is running a family generation. So if you're remarried to another husband, do you lose what? To the land ownership of your previous husband? Do you pay back the dowry, etc.? You becomes even more complicated. So family reunion is one of the biggest strategies to be able to measure how successful all solutions put in place are and whether they are durable. Because family reunion will minimize, family reunion and documentation of identity will minimize those risks of remarrying when your husband is still alive. Because then they will know where your husband is, they'll be able to reunite you and prevent all those unwanted negative effects. And then we need to make sure that internally displaced people are involved in decision-making because they are the one affected. They know how badly affected they are, and they know they want. So one of the indicators is to what extent are internally displaced people involved in decision-making for activities, programs, and policies being put in place to promote and enforce durable solutions. But most of the time, their involvement may be minimal, but it's one of the indicators to see that without their involvement, then those solutions are not to be durable. This is more controversial because while we're talking about access to judiciary system, a legal system, but in most countries, due to corruption, those legal systems may not necessarily be stable, but it's worth putting on the table because not all countries, corruption differ at various levels, but we need to be aware of the threat to this indicator, which is more corruption and non-sustainable legal systems. And finally, the last one of the tools to address the need of internally displaced people is now the United Nations framework. So just remember, before we leave this lecture, I want you not to get confused. So there are three important tools I've described here. The first one was the guiding principle, which was a soft law. The second one was the Great Lake Protocol, which was a hard law. The third one was the Kampala Convention. Then the interagency. So those are the hard laws. The interagency, which is an implementing framework rather than a law. Remember, the law is more giving up those principles and the laws to abide, but the implementation strategy is how do we implement, such as defining those indicators. That's why the interagency is an implementation protocol rather than a guiding principle. And then the United Nations framework is also an implementation framework because it builds on the Standing Committee standards and criteria to measure durable solution by outlining some of the priorities. Because remember, the standing committee came up with those indicators, came up with those standards, but they didn't tell you who is responsible for what. For example, it's good to measure, let's say, improvement in standards of living, but they didn't tell you who should be responsible for those indicators. So this now is about outlining the roles, responsibility, and accountability. So who is going to be responsible ensuring that those indicators can be met? And as you can see again, they are emphasizing the state responsibility rather than the UN responsibility. Remember, if you're a refugee, it becomes a UN responsibility. But because these guys are not refugees, you can see the emphasis is on a state responsibility. Now, in order to make the state responsible, we need to make sure that the state is not oppressive toward internally displaced people. And that's why you need governance, democracy, and peace building. Okay? So, state responsibility. And the need to adopt route-based approaches, and I'm pretty sure Deborah must have covered the route-based approaches in her lectures or other visiting lectures. We need the need to adhere to the do no harm. Most of you who wants to go to work as police, those of you who want to go to work with the UN, I worked with the UN myself, I know how to operate, you may find that one of the biggest Bible we use wherever I go, it's the do no harm book. So if you pick up the do no harm book, it will give you all the principles to adhere to be able to achieve the do no harm principle. It's a wonderful book, a small book, but those planning to go to work overseas with NGOs, UN, etc., do no harm becomes your Bible because it gives you all the tools you need to make sure you fulfill the do no harm principles. And that is complemented by the Sphere guidelines. Anyone knows the Sphere guidelines? The Humanitarian Charter. Anyway, it's free of charge. The book, you can download it free of charge. Only if you're interested to go to work with the NGOs, UN, but if you don't intend, you may find it boring. But if you're interested, they are called the Sphere Guidelines, Humanitarian Guidelines / Humanitarian Charter, and you have access to a free book. And that book gives you all the human rights principles, but the bias is toward the needs of refugees rather than the need of internally displaced people. And you need to adhere to evidence-based programming. Yeah? Yeah? Yes, I think the cornerstone of the do no harm, so many principles, but the best principle is that do it from the perspective of the person you are going to help. Because most of the time what we do is we come in as an expert. I am an expert. I did my degree at Western Sydney. I know better than everyone. But you forget that the person you are going to work with, they know better what affected them. They know better the environment they work in. They know better the chiefdom. They know better the traditional structure. They know better. So you need, the do no harm is first respect the person and the structure within which they operate in. And whatever you do need to come from that perspective, not the perspective you imported from wherever you're coming from. And that's the first principle of do no harm. It's an umbrella that governs all the other principles of no harm. Did I answer your question? Fantastic. So, because the danger is when we come there, and I remember, I can give you an example. I shouldn't be telling this, but I'm being recorded, I'll be careful. I'll give you an example. How I put the no harm into practice. When I was the head of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, public health programs, in my portfolio, I was overseeing programs for 650,000 refugees. So it's big intervention. And I remember they send in my programs 2 nurses from Ireland. And often those nurses, they come as expatriate on a high salary, higher than the local people. But the local people are well-trained, know the knowledge. And for example, one of the do no harm in my public health programs was, for example, that if a child had I don't know whether you know kwashoko, which is when people, the kids who had swollen foot, like a football, so we call it kwashoko. I wouldn't be technical. The do no harm means, it means that you can't give them diuretic. But medically trained and nurses trained in Australia, they know that, you come and start giving diuretic. You give a child diuretic, they will die. But if you ask traditional trained people, they know that you can't give diuretic. And I remember, I found the two nurses already given diuretic to those children without having asked the local trained people who were knowledgeable. So I had to suck them on the spot, but it didn't make me a good friend because then I was seen as the anti-expatriate. So that again, I'm saying they do know harm. They came with very high knowledge. I'm not saying their knowledge is not good, but they did more harm by not taking into account the knowledge of those locally trained nurses, locally trained public health nutritionists, without even consulting the community leaders who actually they have known how to deal with the situation traditionally before even Westerner came in with Western medication. But if you're interested in that book, you're welcome. I think we have a book in the library anyway. The Do No Harm book is in the library. You are welcome to borrow it and go to read it. Now, may I conclude my lecture without boring you, I hope? So what we can do is we can accept that while refugees are really well protected under the Refugee Convention, are protected under the humanitarian law, and that they are protected under the refugee law, internally displaced people still don't have a concrete law that protects them and gives them right to shelter, right to protection. But we have seen some progress. We've had already the protocols, and we've had some implementing policies that are complementing those protocols. The issue has been ratifying them because they are hard laws. So which means then by not ratifying them, it becomes very hard to implement them. And so the soft law, which are the guiding principle, and the hard laws, which are the Kampala Convention and the Great Lake, and then the implementing protocol, which is the Interagency Standing Committee and the UN framework. So these maybe one day, once we can convince that states should ratify it, and every state ratifies them, then internally displaced people will have a framework that will protect them and be able to help them achieve durable solutions. In your discussions, I put some questions for you to start thinking about in a tutor or in preparation for your essay or your exams, whatever it is now from now on, after having listened to me, and I hope I didn't bore you, you will be able to differentiate between soft and hard laws and how they relate to the needs of internally displaced people. You will be able to articulate the difference between humanitarian laws from refugee laws and from human rights laws. And you'll be able to differentiate between soft, hard laws or / protocols from implementing frameworks. Okay? And if you liked my lecture, you know that we started this year a new and exciting degree in humanitarian development studies. This is my baby, and we are doing fantastically well. And we have 2 majors there. So the humanitarian preparedness. We are training the next UN secretary, that's it. So next time when I say UN secretary from my uni who did my degree, I'll be more than happy. Thank you very much. Happy to take a question. Yes. 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 Fantastic. So, and most, and thank you for bringing this. And this is so important because demographic profile will increase your vulnerability. And so let's use, for example, a gender. When people are displaced and they're separated, young women are open to rape. And rape is one of the biggest issues during internal displacement. So being able now to acknowledge the risks women will be exposed to in terms of rape, abduction, forced marriage, etc. Those are issues that young girls will be faced with during internal displacement. In terms of children, children may be taken for slaves, against their will, taken away from their family. They can be traded to pedophiles because internal displacement brings, brings all those challenges. Elderly people may be exploited, elderly people where their documents are stolen and used for other purposes. So these demographic profiles will expose people to different risks. So by knowing who they are and what are the risks are, then you can be in a position to prevent them. So child slavery, rape and abduction, forced marriage, exploitation of the powerless, mainly elderly. It could be the oppression of the minority religiously, such as, again, you need to make sure you understand the religion makeup. And those who are minority will tend to be oppressed, for example. Diversity could be on sexuality and gender. And in most countries, even though we have gay, but we don't talk about it. And if you are caught talking about gay in some countries, you go to prison. So, like in Malawi, if somebody comes in the street and say, she's lesbian, that's it. They will hammer you. And you'll be, but does it mean she's not lesbian? She is. But people are afraid to come out because some governments, it's like you have committed a crime by being gay, which, seriously, I don't see that it's an issue. But some governments are oppressive and are fearing that sexuality. So it's a diversity. So knowing that during the internal displacement, what are the rights for if you're gay, if you're bisexual, if you're a transgender, what are your rights? How can you protect them? So those are the issues that need to be taken into account, and they may require a very good assessment and knowing how to protect them. Because if in a country like Malawi, Zimbabwe, Uganda, you're going to go to prison for being gay. Uganda don't go showing I'm gay because they're coming out, but they're cracking on them. So knowing the rights during internal displacement, how do we protect them? Did I answer your question? Yeah. So these are knowing really those risks and protection-related issues and how you can deal with them is very important. Otherwise, you run the risk of not achieving a durable solution because you didn't tailor your intervention according to the needs based on the demographic profile of your beneficiaries. Yeah. Yes. Yes, so evidence-based programming is based on don't come to start new things or reinvent the wheel, because the danger is to come to reinvent the wheel. Go and implement what we know has worked in the past and tailor what has worked to the needs of our constituency. And usually there will be evidence. Those that have worked are published there. And make sure, and when I mean evidence, it's not only that what works we know has worked, but also are within the prescribed guidelines and standards. So first you need to have to be known to have worked. That's condition number one, and that's the evidence-based programming. And second, you need to fall within accepted and prescribed guidelines and standards. Because if it's outside the prescribed guidelines and standards, then you are going into the doing the harm, and you are going outside of do no harm principle. Yeah? So what are the points again? I've explained the diversity and so to adopt the rights means, the rights you need to make sure you know what are the rights of people and make sure the rights can be upheld, and don't do things just because you want to help. because sometimes it can be helpful at the same time where you are oppressing their right. So you need to make sure that whatever you do is right-based, okay? Oh, feel free. Be my guest. Yeah.
Refugees and asylum seekers.
Yes.
So, let's take, for example, would you say that you are more likely to find internally displaced people when you've got a situation of landlocked countries?
So it's a combination of many things. Poverty, for example, even if it's landlocked, but if you have money and there's a disaster, you can still get out of a locked country. So yes, being locked could be one of the barriers, but I think mainly it's poverty when people can't afford. See, look, if there's a disaster and you can pay the ticket and get out, you run quickly. But if you are poor, what do? You just, move to the mountain. So being in a landlocked could be a barrier, but the biggest barrier is more poverty. And not only poverty, the biggest challenge is documentation. But because in most countries, as soon as you leave the capital city, you ask them, do you have a passport? They say, what's a passport? So most people living in their country, they don't even know what a passport is. So for them, the idea of going out, to go out, you have to have a passport. And some country passport is out of reach. Like in my country, for example, Congo, it's almost 3/4 of Australia in size, and the passport have to always be obtained from the capital. So if you come from an east, first to get a passport, it's difficult, and second, a passport I think costs $350 US, and that's already a salary for I don't know, higher than a salary of a professor in Congo. So clearly, there's it's poverty, is structural issues that I'm saying, political issues, and a combination of many factors.
Okay, so for a country like Australia, which basically is anything but landlocked,
yes,
it is an island nation,
yeah,
which is unusual.
Yes.
That basically we would never have the situation of internally displaced people.
Oh no, you can. You can. In actual fact, you can because it's because we are stable. But if there was a conflict in Victoria where people have to run, where do they go? New South Wales becomes your closest. So you become as soon as you leave Victoria to New South Wales, you become an internally displaced person. So as soon as you leave Victoria, so internally displaced people is as long as you don't cross the border, you're all right. Or if you live in Melbourne, you run away to Shepparton, which is far away from Melbourne, you are still seen as an internally displaced person. Or if you are here, there's a war in New South Wales, you leave Sydney, you run away, you go to God knows where, near the border of South Australia. You find that that's the safest way to be. That's an internally displaced person. So being landlocked is a likelihood of making people internally displaced people, but when they have money, people can still get out. However, boats are there. That's why we have a boat. That's why, despite Italy being far away, from Libya to Italy, it's a boat. That's how they come to Australia. So being landlocked is not stopping asylum seekers. So because they have the means, they can pay people and pay for the transport to look for asylum seekers. So those who couldn't stayed home to be internally displaced person.
So in many ways, what you're actually saying is that internally displaced people are often the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable.
That's it.
And if you have vulnerable groups within
Yes.
the internally.
That's it. So vulnerability within vulnerability.
On top of vulnerability.
That's it. And that's why age, gender, diversity, etc. need to be taken into account to realize vulnerability within vulnerability within vulnerability. Yeah. But I'm not saying that the fact that asylum seekers could afford to pay that they are better off, because I don't want to be accused of
No.
saying they are the select elite. I still believe in the right of asylum seekers. I still believe that they should be given the right to, to refugee studies. But it's just they are the select of the it's in different, yeah, that's it.
Yes, it is a different group.
And that's why the Australian government is so adamant they shouldn't come to Australian land, because soon they hit Australian land under the UN Convention. Australia has no right, has no choice but to accept them.
Yes.
That's why keeping them on Australia is like, okay, as long as you are there, you are not a refugee yet. Because once they hit here, then the Australian government will be obliged under the UN Convention, which Australia has ratified, because we are a signatory, to give them. So that's the fear. The fear is we keep you away as far as away, so you don't fall under the UN Convention. Yeah.
Exactly.
Any other question before I run away?
Don't worry, you can find him though.
Yeah, you can't miss me. I'm waiting.
How about you take the opportunity to give a little bit of a blurb, because you finished early.
Oh,
About
efficiency.
the new degree.
Efficiency. Efficiency.
About the new degree,
Oh.
especially given that, well, this unit is actually part of it.
Yeah, so I think it's a core, isn't it? It's one of the core subjects. So, so this is our new degree. So this is our new degree. We have two specialties. We have so the humanitarian preparedness and the response. So these are more people who, like those who go, once there is an emergency, the UN, you got to put all the program in place in full response. But there's also the human rights protection. These are more during development or during emergency, who are implementing the human rights principles, etc. So the advantage of this degree, though, is that one of the prerequisites, it's a 3-month semester-long placement overseas. So most of them will be placed in NGOs and UN agencies for 3 months, and overseas. Oh, they can do it here in Australia, because not everyone is an overseas traveler. So like UNICEF Australia, UNHCR Australia, they can still be placed, and after 3 months they need to produce a report which will go to their assessment, and after that they are there to go to take over the world, or they can do our masters that's coming up, Masters of Humanitarian Development Studies, and go on to become who knows, take over the world. So that's our new degree, but I'm not encouraging to leave what you are doing. If you love what you are doing, continue. It's just saying this is another option, but continue what you are doing, because I'm not encouraging to leave your existing degree. It will be unethical. It's just to give you another perspective, since you are doing some of the units, to think about. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank
you. Thank you, Deb, for inviting me.
And yes, we'll see you in tutorials.
Yes.